Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. United States President Donald Trump has announced to suspend immigration to the U.S. temporarily. In a tweet, he said, I quote, in light of the attack from the invisible enemy, as well as the need to protect the jobs of our great American citizens, I will be signing an executive order to temporarily suspend immigration into the United States, unquote. President's move has been condemned, especially by the Democrats, who accused the president of using the pandemic to crack down on immigration and divert attention from his slow and faulty response to the pandemic. However, some of his supporters have defended his decision. Further details of this announcement are awaited. What are the legal bases of this decision? How will it be implemented? How will it affect the people? Why has this been announced specifically now? And what possible gains could President Trump take away from this? To understand this, we are joined by Mr. Arturo, Garcia, a lecturer at the law faculty at the Friedrich Schiller University from Weimar, Germany, and Dr.mark Meirowitz, who is a political analyst and professor at the State University of New York at Maritime College. Thank you, both of you, for your time. I'll start the discussion with you, Dr. Meirowitz. How do you see this move by President Donald Trump? Do you consider it a move that is opportunistic, or is it a panic move?
First of all, we haven't seen the executive order yet, Jawad. That's coming out today, so we don't know what it covers, but it's apparently a 60-day temporary suspension of all new green cards applications, and it's not clear who it affects and what the exemptions are going to be. So once we know that, then we can evaluate it better. But if you saw the president's press conference yesterday, he justifies this by saying that he's looking at the unemployment in the country, and he is concerned that he wants to have jobs for Americans. Now, I'm not saying that's valid or invalid, but if you look at it on face value, it's very consistent with Trump's policies on immigration. And from a legal point of view, because I'm also a lawyer, I mean, I think that the lawyers seem to say, and maybe my colleague will comment on this, that Trump can make this, promulgate this. But again, we don't know the whole scope of it. Is it opportunistic? Well, I don't know if it's opportunistic, but certainly his base will like it, and that will help him in the election in November. So there's no question about that.
Dr. Meirowitz will go in detail. How is it going to turn out for giving him gain in the upcoming election in November? Mr. Garcia, what do you think about this move? Do you consider, because the Democrat critics have been saying that there are two reasons the president has come up with this sort of a move at a time when the country is hard hit by the pandemic and there was a faulty and slow response on the part of the president, and he's trying to divert the attention from his faulty and slow response. The other thing which they are criticizing him for is that he has been holding this agenda since his presidential election campaign in 2016, and now he is using pandemic to crack down on the immigration. What do you say about it?
Well, thank you for having me. I wouldn't say it is opportunistic just because I wouldn't use that term, but it's clearly electoral policy, because that was the kind of policy that prompted him in 2016 when he won the elections. Back in the day, that was the topic of the wall in the border with Mexico. And me coming from the border with California, I know that this process of getting the immigration status in the United States takes years. So as a lawyer and as a person that I've been dealing with these issues with people close to me, having this background of immigration, I know that this is just a move in the paper that it wouldn't specifically affect the results of people getting into the United States as an immigrant in the short term, because these processes, like I say, they take years. So I think it's a move more on the electoral side. Like Professor, my colleague said, is clearly going to attract his electoral base for the coming elections, and the people who voted for him for the same reason of the Mexican wall, the border is going to vote for him now, being him like my colleague said, being very keeping his policies in the immigration topic really straightforward.
Dr. Meirowitz, you said that it might be for 60 days, but according to CNN, there are certain White House officials who have shared the information which are closer to this particular plan. They are of the view that it might be for 120 days. How is this particular executive order going to be implemented?
Well, once again, we don't know what the executive order will cover. And right now, 60 days is an eternity with the pandemic. 120 days is a millennium. I mean, we're living day to day right now. So so when he promulgates this, it looks temporary, but it's quite significant. On the other hand, we don't know what the scope of it is. We also don't know what the exemptions are. The president was asked yesterday, are there exemptions? Yes, there will be exemptions. So, I mean, maybe it's more, I mean, already the border is already shut down in many respects. The United States has already cut off. It's made travel bans in connection with the pandemics and restrictions. So it's questionable what the actual impact of this move will be once we know what the scope of it is. But I think it is electoral in nature. But if you listen to what the president is saying, and I think that's something we need to evaluate, is in fact, if you cut off green card holders and if you make this implementation, will that in fact help Americans find jobs? And that's the question which I heard it, I listened to it, I tried to evaluate it, but I didn't know how it really played out. I mean, I assume he means it. And again, he wants to attract his base. That's true, but it's very, very consistent with the policies he's implemented. Now, about the pandemic and how the president has run the pandemic, that we can speak legions about and the problems with that. So I think this one, I think it remains to be seen what they come out with. And by the way, what they come out with, and my lawyer colleague will hopefully agree with me, will have to pass muster in the courts because it will be challenged in the courts, as all Trump's immigration moves have been challenged, including the first travel ban, which the court overruled. So I think that we have to have a wait-and-see attitude about this. America and the world is in turmoil. There's a pandemic. This just adds more distraction and confusion. Is it necessary?
So,
well,
Dr. Meirowitz is of the view that it could be challenged in the court of law as well, as there were certain restrictions which were imposed earlier by the president, which were overturned by the court. But this time around, the situation at home is different. When it comes to the national interest and the job protection of the American citizens and containing the spread of the virus, so the court might not like to overturn this particular decision if once challenged over there for the larger interest of the American citizens.
The statute, the immigration law, is very clear that the president can take action in the national interest. The language is very, very loose, very amorphous. So, the lawyers initially who looked at this and the pundits who are looking at it are saying that they think this will pass muster. And again, it's temporary, right? And it's also limited in certain respects, so to certain groups of people. So, in other words, it's not targeting any particular ethnic group or any country in any respect. That was the problem with the first travel ban. So it probably will pass muster. But the question is, number one, what will the impact be? We really don't know. Will it help? And will it help to achieve what the president says he wants to help, which is to get more jobs for Americans when we have an unprecedented amount of unemployment?
Okay. Mr. Garcia, how does this particular move affect the world at large? What is going to be the reaction that you see? Or is this a move going to make the people turn towards the other countries for getting immigration, which are emerging economies in particular?
Well, two things I would like to comment. First off, as my colleague said, the court will probably will have to resolve on this issue, like a lot of another Trump's decisions. And something else is, it's very important to know if they are going to stop new applications or also applications that are still in the process. Because if they're just going to stop, like I said, new applications, those applications take sometimes years. So that's not going to have an impact that we'll see right away. But if they're stopping applications that are now under the decision-making phase, then that's going to impact the numbers that we're going to see of immigrants going to the United States. And I think that has a lot of relationship with your question, because if that's the case, but still we don't know how much time it's gonna be implemented. If people are going to be turned down by this new regulation or this new approach or this new executive order, we don't know, because we still don't know what the content of this executive order is going to be.
So, Mr. Garcia, in the past, we know that President Trump has been very vocal about anti-immigration measures, and particularly when we talk about Germany, when there were a huge number of immigrants taken in, and President Trump was very blunt in criticizing Chancellor Merkel's such policy. So do you think that resonates with what the voter base he has got inside America?
Of course. Like my colleague said, he's very consistent on his immigration policies, and he was very vocal against the measures taken by the European Union. And I think that the European Union is going to use this as a matter of criticism for Trump's policy. The European Union has been distancing from Trump's and from his partner, the United States, ever since Trump got into the position in 2016. So I think it's going to be another case where the European Union is going to distancing itself from the foreign policy of the United States. But that's not news that we can take as something surprising.
Mr. Arturo Garcia, analyst and lecturer at the law faculty at the Friedrich Schiller University of Weimar, Germany. Thank you for your time at Newswire. Dr. Meirowitz, coming back to the same question that is of utmost importance, whether this move in near future would be able to restore the trust of the Americans in the president, and would it actually help in protecting the jobs for them?
Well, as I said, we don't know the effect of it because we don't know yet what the extent of it will be. As far as the view of Americans, we're a polarized society, and we're in a pandemic, as all the countries in the world are. So things are extremely difficult. People are dying, there's illness. It's a horrific situation. So concentrating on politics is really not the first priority. It really should be the science and figuring out how to get out of this situation. There is an election coming. Trump is very sensitive to it. And to my mind, I'm very candid about it, I don't think politics belongs in this discussion at all. And the question is about this immigration issue. Is that politics, or is that something economic, to do something for economics? I just want to comment quickly on Professor Garcia's point about the EU. To my mind, I really don't feel that what the EU has to say is at all of any importance whatsoever. The EU is in complete dysfunction. It is a dystopia at the point that the northern countries like Germany are refusing to help provide bonds to Italy. Italy is suffering. Brexit is ripping the EU apart. So the EU is in a downswing. The United States is going to come back. People are going to want to come to this country. And honestly, we're at a threshold where we have a November election where this is going to be pivotal to see what the direction of this country will be. That all hinges on where we are with the pandemic, whether we can find a vaccine, whether we can find antibodies, whether we can find treatments. That is the priority now. So when the president brings in all these immigration and politics and all these other things and liberating, as you're showing these protests to encourage these protesters, that's really not, to me, it's not appropriate. It doesn't fit in the scenario where we should be focusing on scientists and medicine and solving the pandemic. So again, I don't know where we're going to go with this. I mean, I'm going to be candid about it. I don't think it's going to have a tremendous impact, as Professor Garcia said, because look, if it's new green card applications, then that's not going to be an issue right now. The country is in disarray anyway. America's suffering from the pandemic like everybody else. If it's a green card pending applications, I think maybe that might even be challenged in the court. I think that would be challenged as they're in the hopper and they are pending.
Okay, so you're of the view that it might be, there is a highly likelihood of it being challenged in the court of law. Dr. Meirowitz, we are now joined by Hadi, our Purnama analyst and researcher in international humanitarian law from Amsterdam. Thank you for your time at Newswire. How do you see this move by President Donald Trump? Do you consider it a panic move to divert the attention from his faulty and slow response to the COVID-19 pandemic, or an opportunistic move for his long-term agenda that he was holding since his presidential campaign in 2016?
I think what has been taken by President Trump, it's not really new, because I think what the policy about immigration itself is already there before he mentions that connected with this COVID-19 disease in United States. So, I mean, it's because this is, I mean, under international law, of course, this is kind of like violating the refugee conventions, although United States is not the part of the refugee conventions. However, United States is the party to the protocol of the refugee convention. So, I mean, this is also very clear. I think that the United States, what President Trump's trying to do is just to connect with his electoral base rather than focusing on the issues of the immigration itself.
Mr. Purnama, what do international conventions and the law say when it comes to the national interest? Because in the tweet, President Trump has said that it is to protect the American citizens' jobs as well as the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic in the country. So in terms of the national interest, what does the international law has to say about it?
So under international law, of course, there is one of the very important principles under the Refugee Convention is that the principles of non-refoulement, which means that the people, the refugees, cannot be sent back to their home countries because of the persecutions they face in their countries. So this is clearly actually violating the international principles on the refugees. And then the most important thing in this issue is that United States should, of course, respect the international conventions and also respect the positions of the United States under these refugee protocol conventions.
Mr. Purnama, even the outbreak in the country itself, so a country has to respect that particular basis of international law, that it has to take the refugees no matter what?
Yeah, it's not, there is a process between you accepting the refugees. I think this process is very important to be seen and to be analyzed in order to see what policy can works in these conditions, especially during this outbreak. I mean, limiting certain movement of people, it's still acceptable, but if what happens is like forbidding people to enter to certain countries, of course, that is the violations. I mean, it's very different between limiting refugees to enter to certain countries than really doing prohibitions for those refugees, because they still have this obligation.
Dr. Meirowitz, last question, when we talk about two varying narratives that are put forth by President Donald Trump. On one side, he's encouraging explicitly the protests which have erupted in the United States by saying that the things are turning out to be normal and the number of infections in the country are decreasing. And on the other side, in this particular tweet, he's of the view that we have to protect the Americans from the spread of the COVID-19. Doesn't it send a mixed message to the world?
Well, first of all, the president has sent many mixed messages, but I don't want to fail to comment on Professor Purnama's point. I don't agree with his point, my colleague, with due respect, about the Refugee Convention, its applicability here. I believe the Supreme Court has looked at these issues. Yes, the Senate did ratify this, I think, back in 1951, years ago. Truth of the matter is, the president's leeway and power in the immigration area is very, very extensive. And as we've seen, President Trump's immigration orders have been upheld by the courts with the exception of the first travel ban. He has a lot of authority, especially in an emergency situation. And I don't see this refugee convention as being in any way applicable to this issue. And by the way, who is going to enforce the International Refugee Convention against the United States? There are no international courts that have any jurisdiction. The United Nations is absent from this issue. Now, about the protests and speaking to the protesters who you're showing on your screen, this is very problematic, and that should not be in the dialogue on this. These people coming out of the woodwork, they're talking about gun rights, they're talking about vaccines, they're talking about all sorts of things that are not relevant to the fact that Americans and people all over the world are suffering from the pandemic, and to be very candid, putting politics into the mix. But why? To go back to our original point, it's all electoral, because when he says he wants to liberate these states, like Virginia, Minnesota, Michigan, those are key electoral states for him. So, that thing, I think, he should step back, let the scientists and the doctors run the show, and not put all this politics into the mix, which really interferes and, as you said before, provides a mixed message on what we should be doing. We need guidance from leaders, not confusion. And that's what we're getting.
So, Dr. Meirowitz, you're of the view that Donald Trump shouldn't politicize the pandemic. In short, thank you for being with us on the show. Dr.Mark Meirowitz, political analyst and professor at the State University of New York Maritime College, and Mr. Hadi, Purnama analyst, researcher in international humanitarian law, joining us from Amsterdam. Thank you for your time as well on Newswire. With this, we come to the end of the first segment of the show. In the second, we will look into what made the U.S. oil to nosedive over 300%, first time ever in the history. But after a short break, stay tuned. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Jawad Tehami. Once considered black gold, oil has become valueless all of a sudden as the U.S. oil markets went into negative territory for the first time in history. U.S. benchmark West Texas Intermediate nosedived 300%, tumbling to minus $40 a barrel on Monday. Brent crude also dropped below $20 per barrel for the first time in 18 years. One of the most precious commodities, which used to be the engine of economic activity and growth, has no more demand. To understand what rendered oil to be a commodity of no value from its black gold status, we are joined by Mr. Tom Sullivan, energy expert from Tokyo, and Mr. John Kingston, oil expert, freight, joining us from New York. Thanks for your time, both of you. I'll start the discussion with you, Mr. Kingston. How basically the global oil markets work and why this particular crash now? What exactly led to this crash?
Well, I mean, the big picture, of course, is that supply and demand are completely out of whack because demand has created as much as 30% because of the global pandemic. Supply hasn't really dropped at all yet. It's supposed to start dropping soon, but it really hasn't dropped so much. What happened on Monday as far as the negative price, it's the expiration of the May contract for West Texas Intermediate on the CME exchange. And without going into great detail, because it is a physically delivered contract, if you were holding a long position, you had the real risk of being delivered oil on that final day that you really had no place to put because storage is so full. And you really, if you're a hedge fund, you don't have any tanks, you have no place to put that oil. So you had to get out of your position. So as companies flocked to the exits to try to get out, the people who had a short position could really hold the feet to the fire of the long position, and they could eventually ask for money as well as taking the position. So it was a quirky thing related to this contract, but it certainly does speak to the broader supply-demand imbalance.
Okay, what actually led to this particular crash? What the oil companies continue to produce the oil in a huge quantity, and there was no demand just because of the lockdowns, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, or were there other factors as well?
It really is it. I mean, that's kind of the very, you can go into a lot of other detail, but on a broad basis, that is it. World demand has crashed anywhere from 25 to 30 million barrels a day off of a base of about 100 million barrels a day at the close of 2019. There have been really almost no signs of any cut in production up until maybe recently. The U.S. shale industry was continuing to pump it out. The Saudis and the Russians failed to put together their OPEC Plus agreement at their meeting in March, so they all went home and increased their production, or at least kept it steady, even as demand was crashing. Now, there has since been a deal among the OPEC Plus nations, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and many others, but that's not even supposed to kick in until May, and it's questionable whether how much impact it's going to have. It was only supposed to cut about 10 million barrels a day, a little less than that. And it was supposed to do it in a market that lost demand of about 30 million barrels a day. So you can see even there continues to be an imbalance. And the big problem is now for somebody producing it, yes, it's always great. You can put it in storage, sell it forward, and still be able to profit. But you're literally running out of places to put it now.
Okay. Mr. Sullivan, how much do you think that the price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia has worsened the things? It's just been alluded by Mr. Kingston as well.
Well, absolutely, Jawad. That played a very critical role in the collapse of the oil prices, because the failure of the OPEC Plus countries to agree a production cut happened as the coronavirus and medical emergency was raging at the same time. So, yes, that was a catastrophic breakdown. And what we're now starting to see, of course, President Trump seemed to intervene in encouraging the Russians and the Saudis to come up with a production cut that John just referred to. And it also looks like, the United States, and John can speak to this better than I can, but the United States will also have to cut production by 2 to 3 million barrels per day.
When we talk about the future contract, and this was the contract for May, which had a crash, how much there is a possibility of the recovery in the prices for the next month, particularly when we talk about June?
Well, I think just looking at the prices today, Joe, it looks like the June futures is trading at about $14. But as you said, the Brent price has now dropped below 20, and we saw a total collapse in futures oil prices on the Tokyo Commodity Exchange as well today. So I think we're still obviously a month away from the June contract expiring, so I think we have to wait and see. But it would not surprise me if we went in the same direction that we saw just yesterday with the May contract, where we were looking at negative prices.
Mr. Kingston, when we differentiate for the understanding of our viewers, how we do differentiate between the West Texas Intermediate and the Brent crude, which is an international benchmark. If the prices go down in the West Texas Intermediate and they have a crash, so do they directly impact the international benchmark as well?
I don't know if that's for me. Eventually it will. It didn't used to for a long time when you could not export U.S. crude. WTI could drop and Brent would barely move because the surplus that was growing in the U.S. couldn't be exported to the rest of the world. Obviously, it would have impacted imports. But once the U.S. started allowing exports in 2015, the two oils became a lot more correlated. And so eventually, as you're seeing, as Tom referenced, Brent is on the way down too. WTI certainly led the way. I did want to mention one thing. June, even though the May contract, we can say, well, that was kind of quirky. It was unique to that particular contract. There's no doubt that June reacted yesterday in what happened to May. It didn't want to do the same thing. And I would imagine that one difference that's going to be happening this month is that a lot of those long positions that might have gotten stuck in May, and they were the ones that had to pay up to get out of those contracts, they're not going to wait till the end. I know that there are first of all, there are a lot of hedge funds that are oil-specific hedge funds. I know of at least 2 or 3 that liquidated in the last day or two, so they're out of the market. And anybody else who's still staying, like the U.S. Oil Fund, they are not going to wait till the end to get rid of their positions. They're not going to go through this again. So I would think that is going to be one difference between June and May. But still, it ultimately comes down to the problem that the world is producing more oil than it needs, and it is running out of places to put it.
So, Mr. Kingston, we talk about this particular shock that was in a crude oil market. And when we talk about the refined oil, so does this shock actually give a sort of a breather or relief to the retail consumers as well?
Gasoline had been, gasoline, which the rest of the world calls petrol, had been trending down really faster than crude the past few weeks. Diesel prices have been a little slower to fall because there's still been trucks out on the road still making deliveries, so that had not collapsed as much as gasoline. But they're way down, I'm sure, for truck drivers who are still on the road. They haven't fallen as much as they'd like to fall because they keep hearing of these gigantic collapses in the price of crude, and they're wondering, well, why isn't my price of diesel coming down? But the price of diesel, I mean, in the U.S., measured in the U.S., which we at FreightWaves follow very closely, is down retail-wise, 60, 70 cents over the last several weeks. So it absolutely is giving relief. But as somebody said, the lowest gasoline prices in our lifetime, and we can't take advantage of them because we're not going anywhere.
Okay, Mr. Does this impact the retail consumers, particularly when we talk about the developing countries and particularly the area that you're based in, the northern Far East?
Yes, well, Jawad, yes. Traditionally, it takes about 3 months for the prices to feed through to the retail pump. So we're not going to see significant reductions, and I can talk to the Tokyo market for about 2 or 3 months at the retail pump. And I think the same would go for the emerging markets. But I just kind of want to reiterate as well, if you look at some of the road traffic statistics for India, for example, and for Iraq and some of the other markets, we're seeing road traffic in India, to go back to what John was saying, has collapsed by about 80%. And if you look at a country like Iraq, it's collapsed by about 75 to 80%. So we're seeing huge reductions in road traffic. But as I said, it will take some time before that feeds through to the retail pump across Asia.
When it comes to the oil companies and the people employed in those companies, is there going to be some unemployment that might ensue after this shock wave in the oil markets around the world?
Yes, I would think so, Jawad. I think we could see some bankruptcies, possibly in the United States in the shale space, and we're already seeing some furloughs in some of the international oil companies. We could see some of the maybe offshore oil facilities close in for a while because they're extremely expensive. We're also seeing significant reductions in capital expenditure. The capital expenditure budgets that companies are forecasting now for 2020 and 2021. So we'll also probably see some redundancies in the oil services space as well as the actual oil producers.
Okay, about the future prospects of oil, particularly when we talk about more and more countries are going for the clean and the renewable energy sources. So is the future prospect for oil or its related industry some sort of dark?
I would say this, that to me, the move to clean energy is not so far yet having impact on oil. It's really having an impact on coal or natural gas because those are electric generating fuels. I would say this, I think the biggest threat right now to oil as a fuel is in the transportation sector, not necessarily because it's going to be displaced, but because I really wonder how long it's going to be before we sort of get back to normal. And those mileage statistics, let's say that Tom referred to, they're down 80%. Okay, at the end of this, are they snapping back to what they were before? There's going to be probably a lot of companies that say, you know what, having some of my workers work from home is fine with me now. People don't need to drive to the office. So I think that's the biggest risk in the sort of short to medium term for oil. A move to renewable is really a move against natural gas or coal because those are generating fuels. But for transportation fuels, right now there really isn't a lot of substitute for oil. But I just wonder whether we're going to need it quite as much over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years. I think this is going to have a long-term impact on that.
So, Mr. What do you have to say about this? Are the future prospects of oil and its related industry dark because of the new clean and the renewable energies?
Of course, Jawad, the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. Some of the countries have actually committed to reduce their carbon emissions. And I think we can't forget as well that we're in the middle of this medical emergency. So basically, one of the benefits of solar and wind is that you don't really have a lot of human input in terms of producing the energy. So obviously with a large, coal-fired or gas-powered fire station, you need a lot of human intervention and need a lot of employees. But, for some of the cleaner energy sources, you don't need that human input. These are kind of renewable sources. So I would think it will help to spur ahead some of the, solar and wind development that we're seeing around the world.
So in that sort of a scenario, the future of oil seems dark as its color. Do you agree?
Yes, I would say it's extremely difficult at the moment. As you said at the outset, this is, we've never seen negative prices before. We've seen this, historic collapse in demand that John referred to as well. So I would say, yes, it will take quite a long time for the oil market to recover, and it may never recover to the level that we'd seen, before this medical emergency. I mean, 100 million barrels a day of consumption.
Okay. Thank you very much for being on the show. Ms. Tom Sullivan, energy expert, joined us from Tokyo, and Mr. John Kingston, oil expert, FreightWaves, was joining us from New York. Thank you for your time at Newswire as well. With this, we come to the end of today's Newswire with more in-depth analysis on the major happenings from around the world. We'll be back with you on Monday. Till then, take good care.